This is May 4th, 2006. Our oral history interview today is with Jay Foster. I'm Charles Lundquist. Jay, we're delighted to have you here today. We usually start out by letting the interviewee say a few words about where he spent his youth, where he was educated, and how he got into the space program here in Huntsville.
Well, in my case, it was somewhat accidental. I was born in Manila, Philippine Islands. Moved to Chicago when I was about 5. I grew up pretty much in Chicago, went to the University of Illinois Institute of Technology, and got drafted during the Korean conflict. And I went through basic training, and everybody else in my basic training class got shipped to Korea, and they peeled me out and sent me to Huntsville, Alabama, and here I am.
Where'd you do basic training?
At Fort Leonard Wood, Missouri. I usually call it Misery. But then I spent 2 years here in the military.
You in the 9330 TSU?
Yes, in the 9330 TSU with a number of other people. I was a little bit later classmate from, say, Bob Lindstrom and Stan Reinertz in that group, but it was the same activity. And after my 2 years in the military here, I went back to Chicago and completed my master's degree. And while I was there, Sputnik flew. So when I started looking around for a permanent job, I got a really good offer to come back down here, and I've been here more or less ever since. I did spend a tour of duty in NASA headquarters back in shortly after the initial lunar landing.
Yeah, we'll want to talk about that a little later. Well, what job did you come into when you joined?
Well, in the military and subsequent, when I came back, I was in production engineering, manufacturing, on the Redstone and Jupiter ballistic missiles back in those early days. And I spent the 2 years in the military working on tool design, tool fabrication, determination of tool requirements.
Who were your bosses then?
My bosses back in those early days was, well, my first line supervisor was a gentleman by the name of Maximilian Sabigtaroth. And the laboratory was Hans Maus, and the deputy lab director was Werner Kurs back in those days. And so it was an interesting group of people, and it was pretty exciting.
When you came back as a civilian, where did you go?
Well, I started out by going back into the manufacturing and production engineering, and I ended up for a short time as a head of the production engineering group within the manufacturing laboratory.
What year was that, roughly?
That was in 57, 58 time frame. Just
as the satellite era was about to start.
Yes. In fact, I was on a tour. I was responsible in a working group. Dr. Von Braun had set up working groups for various disciplines for working with the contractors back in the early days of the Saturn I. Actually, it was just a test program in those days. And I was chairman of a manufacturing working group. And I was on a trip out to the West Coast, and I had my family, my wife with me, and we were driving. We took some vacation time en route, and I was halfway between here and Los Angeles when President Kennedy announced the lunar program. And so it was rather exciting to come back and see what was happening. And Dr. Von Braun selected my boss, Hans Maus, at that time, to head up a thing called the Lunar Planning Office, Lunar Program Planning Office, and Hans Maus took me with him. So I left manufacturing very shortly after Kennedy announced the lunar program, and we set up that planning office and tried to integrate all of the different facets of the lunar program into schedules and collect bits and pieces of budget estimates from all over the organization.
Who else was there with you, Maus?
Well, a lot of people are long gone from the program at this point, but One particular gentleman that was became rather important in the program later in life was Ray Klein. We actually hired Ray Klein from the Army, and Ray was he never liked me to tell this, but he was a lawyer by trade by his background, but he was a management analyst, and he was extremely good with words, and he became a outstanding speechwriter for Dr. Von Braun.
Lawyers sometimes are good with words.
Yeah, that's true. Public Affairs did all of the speeches for public kinds of things like Rotary Club and Kiwanis or what have you. But Klein did his speeches for the Congress and for his bosses in Washington.
Well, as the lunar program, the Apollo program, evolved, how did your career evolve with it?
Well, I worked for a number of years in that planning office. It got changed in title a couple of times. It became the Central Planning Office later, but it was responsible for pulling together all of the center's budget activities from all across the different organizational elements, and negotiating those activities with NASA headquarters. Spent a lot of time on the road back and forth to Washington in those times, working budget matters.
So it evolved into a fiscal office.
Fiscal and scheduling. Is in the early days, there was quite a bit of difficulty getting the schedules to fit together. Houston had one set of schedules, and we had another set of schedules, and the spacecraft was launched on different days from the vehicle on paper. And obviously that system couldn't continue, so we did and were responsible for putting together the first integrated schedule where we had the vehicle and the spacecraft all together at the same time on the same dates.
Where were you when the launch took place to the moon? Were you at the Cape or here in Huntsville?
Well, I was at the Cape for the launch itself, and I left the Cape and we went to a family reunion in Indiana, so I was in front of a television set in Indiana for the lunar landing. Ah. With a lot of family members.
But you saw the launch?
But I saw the launch. I was down there.
Well, as the future or the subsequent lunar landings took place, what was your role during that period?
Well, I continued in that activity, and then they had a center reorganization, and they created a administrative and technical support organization, and the remnants or the portions of this central planning office were integrated into that administrative and technical support organization, and I became the deputy director of that under Dave Newby.
Oh, yes.
And that continued on for some time, relatively short time after the lunar landing, and then the first lunar landing, and then Dr. Von Braun decided to move to NASA headquarters, and he chose to take me with him to NASA headquarters, and so I went up to headquarters with him, and Dr. Tom Payne, who was a NASA administrator at that time, he was interested in having Werner do a long-range planning activity for the agency, and this was, remember, this was in 1969, and we had the task of putting together a long-range plan for the year 2000. While 2000 is in the past and beginning to be in the distant past today, 2000 in 1969 was a long stretch.
Long ways off.
And we worked very hard across the agency. We made 2 circles of all the NASA centers, and we put together a document outlining the program that we thought might be feasible or appropriate for the year 2000.
Can you say a few words about what it contained or what you envisioned happening?
Well, it had many of the features that we have today. As a matter of fact, the current program that I see is very similar to what was in that plan. That plan was never published outside the agency, and it was held very close within the agency. The plan was actually taken by Dr. Payne to President Nixon at the time. President Nixon was up to his butt in alligators with Watergate, and the word we got back from that meeting was that he wasn't really too interested in proceeding with new things, that Tom Paine could go back to NASA and continue on the existing programs, but don't really talk to him much about new things. As a result, shortly thereafter, Dr. Paine decided to leave NASA, and Dr. Von Braun, a few months later after that, decided that he would also leave NASA, and he went to Fairchild. And when Dr. Von Braun indicated he was going to leave NASA, I called Eberhard Rees, the then center director at Marshall, and he had told me when I went to Washington that he'd leave a latch string out. So I talked to him and on the phone, and a week or 10 days later he called me back and offered me a position, so I came back to Huntsville at that time.
Can you say a few words about how Dr. Von Braun fared in Washington and his spirits and so forth during that trying period?
I can, but I'd like to answer your the previous question first about the plan.
Oh, okay, fine.
So this plan never saw the light of day, except a few of us knew pretty much what was in it. A couple of decades later, the first President Bush appointed the same Tom Paine, who at that time was Vice President of General Electric, to chair a Blue Ribbon Committee to develop a plan. And that Blue Ribbon Committee published a plan that's in the public domain at this point. And I would say 90% of that plan that Tom Paine had published was the same plan that he showed to President Nixon 20 years earlier.
Well, that's an interesting anecdote.
And that plan that was published is very similar, not necessarily in all its detail, but in a gross thing, is what the agency is currently following. So that's that piece of the story. Dr. Von Braun, in his Washington years, when it started out with Tom Paine there, was very dynamic. As I indicated, we traveled around the country to all the NASA centers, and all the different center directors kind of rolled out their red carpet for us, and we got real insights on how each center director and the key personnel at each center felt about the future and what they thought the future ought to do. And this was all amalgamated into that plan. It culminated into a long weekend, about a 5-day weekend at Wallops, where a group of people attended, a number of center directors and a number of outside individuals that Tom Paine felt should participate in this long-range kind of philosophy, where this plan, elements of the plan, were batted around. And this document that was finally taken by Paine to President Nixon really culminated in that 5-day conference. And Dr. Paine had invited Arthur Clarke, the futurist, the author, and he was kind of the keynote speaker and, in a way, the informal chairman of that session. And my recollection from that was, while he was well known and a national figure, in that group of experts, he felt very timid because all of these things had been fictitious, and here he was in the company of all these people really trying to
real life situations.
It was a very interesting conference, and I do have a copy of a photograph that was taken with all of the participants, and I'd say there was maybe 25 or so participants, and they passed around enough copies, and all the participants signed this photograph, and so I still have that photograph with 25 or so figures.
We'd love to get a copy of that for the archives.
I loaned that photograph to Ernst Stuhlinger for his book, and there's a copy in his book, by the way. But I do have a copy. I do have one of the original copies of that.
Well, I'd love to get a photocopy of that.
So that was the early days, and then after Paine left, things took a turn for the worse for Werner personally, and I think for the organization, and also for a significant period of time after Paine left, George Low was acting administrator. And George Low, as you know, was he had been the spacecraft program manager at Johnson Space Center, and with continuing I won't say really negativism between the two centers, because I think the centers worked very well together once roles and missions were determined. But George Low, being Jewish, still had, from my perspective anyway, still had a bit of a chip on his shoulder against Warner. And of course, with the Nixon position, I don't know that George Low really had much option. I mean, he was under the gun from his boss to continue the existing programs and not talk too much about the future. So von Braun's office in the George Low period tended to dwindle and lose prestige and importance in that sense. And von Braun then chose to leave and go to Fairchild. It was a very interesting and stimulating period in my life, though. We did that planning exercise, and even in the George Low period, Warner still commanded a lot of respect across the world. And we had people come in, and we went to some of those locations, but we had a lot of people come in, like the president of IBM, the president of most of the aerospace companies, a lot of military people came in and talked about the Military Sea Lift Command, for instance, came and talked to us about how they saw the future and how satellites and space might be of benefit to them. So it was very interesting to sit through all of these discussions with these high-level people from across the world, across the U.S.
Well, then you came back to Marshall.
Then I came back to Marshall initially as Dick Cook was here as a number 3 associate director for management, and I came in as Dick's assistant right-hand man, and I did that for a couple of years. And then I moved to be the deputy chief of this administration and program support, which was the follow-on to the A&TS organization. And a couple of years later, when Jim Shepard retired, I became director of that organization, and stayed in that organization with varying responsibilities that had a number of major sub-elements that varied a bit over time, and I retired from that position in 1988.
What were some of the interesting problems that came up during that period? Or were they all interesting?
Well, there were a lot of interesting things. One of the major things I think that we did was Dr. Lucas, who was the center director in those days, had gone to a meeting, I believe it was at Ames, where somebody made a presentation on the computing power across the agency. And they used a graph of the number of megaflops, that's millions of floating point operations per second. And it showed the research centers very high on that list and the development centers very low, and Marshall was not very well represented in that chart. And he brought that chart back, and he came to me and said, you know, your number 1 responsibility is to change that, to bring Marshall up in the computing world. And as a result of that, we put together quite an effort to bring a Cray into Marshall, a big Cray in those days. And at that time, the agency responsibility, or the agency feeling in NASA headquarters, was that the research centers deserved Cray, but the development centers didn't need a Cray. And we decided we had to prove that that wasn't the case. And it took a number of presentations, and I'd say close to a year, but Marshall was the first development center to obtain a Cray and to really move up in that megaflops criteria.
Even before Houston?
Oh yes, definitely before Houston. It was quite a story on how we did this. Herman Thomason at that time in S&E, and I worked very closely together with John Lynn in our computer organization. And Herman and I and John made several trips to Washington presenting this case, moving step by step up the ladder in the national hierarchy. Finally to the point where there was a presentation before Fletcher, who was the administrator at that time. And Bob Siemens was the deputy administrator at the time, and in his final presentation before Fletcher and Siemens, Fletcher finally threw up his hands and he turned to Bob Siemens and he said, "I want you to go to Marshall and review all this in detail, and you make the determination of whether they need a Cray or not." So a few weeks later, Bob Siemens made his trip to Marshall, and Herman Thomason and I set up an agenda for Bob Siemens that was rather interesting. We selected 12 key disciplines, and that's included structural, electrical, thermal, optics, fluid dynamics, etc. And we had 20-minute interviews in the office of the head of each of those disciplines. And it took Bob Siemens around, and after 8 of those 12 discipline discussions with the heads of those disciplines, Bob Siemens threw up his hand and said, "I'll give you your damn Cray."
I had never heard the story.
You heard that story?
No, I'm delighted to hear that.
That was the story. It was quite a struggle, but we did get the first Cray in a development center.
Any other things from that period that you'd like to mention?
Well, we did a lot of facility work. We built a lot of facilities. One of the final facility type things that I did was to get work on the justification the last year and a half or so. Get the justification for the fourth building out there in the headquarters complex, and we did finally get that through. I think the appropriation for that building occurred shortly after I left, but all the paperwork and the development of the justification for that was there. We also worked hard on the for the, it's not the HEA, what's
the Hubble telescope, or the
AXAF, the AXAF facility.
No, the Chandra.
Yeah, the Chandra, the Chandra facility for the X-ray calibration facility, where we had, well, we had worked to get the original facility too, but it was quite difficult to get that several $million addition for the AXAF, and I worked hard on that piece of activity. And there were a lot of facilities. I got the first appropriation to clear the asbestos out of 4610, which, and I don't think that's proceeded very much. There's still a lot of asbestos in the 3 4200 complex buildings. But anyway, one other one that's kind of interesting, we were going to renovate, improve the telephone system, and I'd worked hard with everybody across the center and across the agency to get that justification, and it had gone to Congress, and we had the appropriation to put the new system in, to get rid of those old black telephones and put in the new modern system. And the appropriation was here, and everything was cooking along very nicely, and one fine day my guys came to me and said, "We got a big I forgot." And I said, "What's the problem?" And he says, "Well, you know, this system has a lot wider bandwidth, and we've got 6 buildings that we need more bandwidth. We need fiber. We need increased fiber between 6 major buildings," which included the headquarters complex, the 4663 computer lab, 4708 over there, and the 4610 complex. So anyway, and what's the bill for this? About $2 million. And it's $2 million that is running the institutional part of the center. $2 million is a big number. But I went to Bob Lindstrom at the time, and Bob, in his wisdom, Bob was always very good. My guys and Bob's guys sometimes came apart, but if I ever personally went to Bob and sat down and chatted with him, Bob always managed to find a way to come through with the help that we needed. And in this case, Bob came up with $2 million. Monsieur at that time was going along pretty smoothly, and there was a couple of $1 million in the Monsieur account that wasn't being fully utilized. So he transferred $2 million of Monsieur money to me, to my organization. And I started to do this, but our comptroller at the time, Jack Swearingen, got a hold of this, and Jack decided or thought that you know, we couldn't really use MSHU money up here for put fiber in the ground across the center. And Jack and I, though, sat down, and I told Jack, well, you want to go down and tell Bill Lucas why we can't finish this telephone system, and he demurred, and he didn't want to do that. But what we ended up doing, we put a white paper, we worked very hard on about a 2-page memo that we finally put in a file, which the argument basically was that MSHU is part of Marshall, and it has to pay its fair share of the infrastructure, basically. And so we put that in the file, and we put the $2 million worth of fiber in the ground, and we put our telephone system into place, and there we go.
All right.
And never heard a word from it.
Well, then you retired. What did you do after you retired?
Well, I did several things. I went to work for a company that's headquartered in Titusville, a minority-owned company named BAMSI Incorporated, and BAMSI at that time had about 2,000 employees scattered around the country, and initially I worked on trying to get new business, being a marketing manager, but shortly I became a vice president of operations, and in effect we had 12 projects or 12 contracts in force across the country at 4 NASA centers, the local Army, MICOM, and a couple of Navy installations. And in effect, I had those 12 program managers reporting to me, but it's very different being a government contractor from being on the government side. And as a manager, I didn't really day-to-day manage those folks, because they were really managed, and each one had a contract to fulfill and working with their government counterparts. And my role as a manager was to fly around the country once a month to all 12 locations and interview the government people initially. And if the government was happy, I could go back and pat our project manager on the back and tell him how good a job he was doing and leave. And if the government was unhappy, then I had to sit down with the project manager and do some arm twisting to make some changes, and even to the point where, which you couldn't do very well, at least it was a very laborious process if you ever wanted to fire somebody inside the government. But I ended up having to fire about 4 project managers during the 4 years that I worked for BAMSI. And so after the end of that, I was, after 32 years here with the Army and NASA and 4 years with BAMSI, I decided I really wanted to cut back a bit. And another interesting opportunity came through the doorway. I met some Canadian friends at one of these TABS conferences downtown. You remember TABS was a Technical and Business Exposition and Symposium. And I was at one of those conferences with some BAMSI folks, and we happened to sit around a table with 4 Canadians. And one of these Canadians was he was kind of the head of the Chamber of Commerce for Ottawa, Canada, and the other one was a president of a company. And they invited me, or I invited them to tour the city. They couldn't see the infrastructure, and so I toured them around. And a few months later, the president of the company called me up and indicated that he was interested in outsourcing the operation and maintenance of a Canadian Air Force base. And so my BAMSI friends sent me on a marketing trip to Ottawa one time. And while it was interesting, and subsequently several Canadians came here and toured Marshall and the Army, but that never really developed. They never agreed to outsource. They still do that with their military personnel. But in the process, this company president said that he had a contract with the Canadian Space Agency to provide liaison at Marshall Space Flight Center on a half-time basis. So I ended up working half-time for the Canadian Space Agency for 6 years. And that was rather interesting. The responsibility was, of course, as their liaison back and forth between Huntsville and Canadian Space Agency, which was originally, when I started working with them, in an old World War II Air Force barracks outside of Ottawa, but they moved to a beautiful new facility, Space Center, in Saint-Hubert, which is a suburb of Montreal, and it's a gorgeous facility. It's small by NASA standards, but it's right up to the minute, up to date. And so
I've been there, and I can agree that it is.
It's I worked on integrating Canadian payloads into NASA missions, and also a little bit I helped integrate a payload into Mir, because Marshall had the responsibility for all microgravity science anywhere in the U.S. or anywhere that was a U.S. type payload into Mir, and also a major responsibility was helping integrate three components of the space station Canadian arm into the three shuttle payloads. And that's up there and working. All three of those elements are working on the station today. So that's 6 years, and I was really getting ready to retire, so I quit. I was still doing some consulting, and I still am doing one. I have one client. It's kind of an oxymoron. They're located in Paradise, Newfoundland.
Oh, really?
And
what business are they in?
Well,
I may ask.
They're an acoustics company. Everything they do is acoustics, and we have developed a material science payload that's acoustically levitated.
This is Guignay, then?
This is Guignay International Limited. And our payload is at the Cape. It's ready to fly. In fact, we were ready to fly on the next flight after the accident. And so we've been standing by more or less for 2.5 years. And up until just recently, we were scheduled on this next launch, but now we're kind of in another holding pattern again. So I don't know when that's going to happen. But
so you are no longer on the next launch?
No, we're no longer on the next launch. And we have not been given a firm flight date again. So we're kind of holding tight. It is a rather interesting payload. I don't know if I shouldn't try to get into detail here on that, but it has both commercial use, and it also has significant potential for the Moon and Mars activities, because it helps to develop new materials. And one of the new materials that has come out of the development effort so far is I guess the present day, the toughest kind of drill material is tungsten carbide. And Guignay has developed a titanium carbide with a flash coat diamond dust impregnated on the point. And that material, that drill, is being looked at rather seriously by NASA for possible drilling on the lunar surface and the Martian surface. That's primarily, the Guignay interface on that is primarily JPL. But so that's kind of the history of my career in a way.
You've had a very interesting career. Any broad thoughts you'd like to leave about the future of NASA or anything?
Well, I think I think NASA has a bright future. It has its ups and downs, and as Dr. Von Braun said when he left the agency after we had put together this plan, he said, well, the speed with which you go after this plan is really dependent on the mood of the country and the Congress and a lot of other kinds of things. But he felt that the plan that had been laid out was a reasonable plan for the future. I guess I had some notes. I made some notes here, and you had me talking about my career per se, and I haven't really talked about my notes.
Please do.
Say a few words about them. There's a lot in terms of detail that you can do, but what did you really get? What did I really get out of this? Well, there's a number of things. I think integrated planning. In the early days, manufacturing and later that lunar planning office really integrated the steps. Somebody says we want to launch on day X, and you work back from that. You need to know then when you need your design, when you need your tools, when you need your design, electrical, structural, etc. So manufacturing planning put all that together. And I think a key part was the management tools, and I think we had a number of them at that time. I'm sure there's elements of this, each of these tools existing elsewhere in the world, but I think NASA, Marshall, the Von Braun team had a rather unique integration of these tools. And I would say a number like the staff and board meetings, which all the key people would meet once a month or thereabouts and talk about the progress in each and every activity. We had staff luncheons, and I know the staff luncheons went away, and they went away in part because they were looked at by the workforce as being somewhat elitist. And while I can understand that philosophy, I think the fact that the staff luncheon, where essentially all of the people who reported directly to Dr. Von Braun met daily for lunch, that gave a good cross-section for me personally. You see the problems from every program office, from every laboratory, and it gave you a continuing broader view. And without those staff luncheons, I think each individual organizational element tends to be a little more isolated. It's certainly involved in its own activity, but it misses something in the broader picture and seeing the broader picture on a day-to-day basis. Of course, they had the weekly notes activity, which everybody, each organizational element sent 1 to 2 pages weekly to the center director. And if the center director never read those, I think that would die on the vine. But at least in the case of Bill Lucas, for the 12 years that he was center director, with just a day or two after you sent those notes in, you'd get them back annotated with comments and questions and this, that, and the other thing. And I think it was a very dynamic activity to keep the center tied together. The theory of the matrix organization with automatic responsibility. I think automatic responsibility to some degree has gone away.
Describe that a little more. That's an interesting concept that I don't think we've really gotten well described in these interviews.
Well, I think the automatic responsibility was that each discipline had the automatic responsibility to ensure that their discipline produced excellence in the end product hardware. And if that discipline was structures, for instance, it was not only structures here within in our own design and manufacturing labs, but it was across the contract structure with McDonnell Douglas and Boeing and Martin Marietta and wherever, not just the primes, but the little ones too. And their responsibility was to step up, and if they had a problem, they had to raise the red flag. And usually that could be worked out up through the laboratory structure to the Director of Science and Engineering, sitting down with the project manager, but the project manager didn't have the last word. The project manager, if it really became a problem where the technical people really felt the program was going to go the wrong way, that ended up on Dr. Von Braun's desk, and that thing was worked out. And I think the fact that those two organizational elements, the program management organization and the science and engineering, the technical organization, and in my case, although a somewhat different deal in the facilities, we did have one case where we had a problem where we couldn't come to agreement with S&E. This was when, in the early days of the Apollo program, I mean the early days of the shuttle program, where we had to take the dynamic test stand and we had to tear down one wall and increase the footprint by a 24 by module and then build it up again. And when we tore the wall down, some of our friends in science and engineering felt that we hadn't taken a proper, from the facilities office side, a proper response to prevent wind damage in case of a hurricane force or something to knock the rest of the structure down. And so we had to compete the facilities design folks against the S&E design folks, and this was the facilities thing. We did have several sessions leading up to it, but we finally had a pretty hard session with Dr. Von Braun about that. I mean, excuse me, with Dr. Lucas about that in that time frame. And Lucas finally decided, because, well, first of all, it was going to cost about $500,000 more to do it the S&E way. And you know Lucas, the way he digs into all the technical details, so he finally became convinced that the facilities engineering activities were right. And after all, this was a facilities problem. It was not a vehicle problem, and so it's a little bit
Yeah.
different technology. So we finally did save that $500,000. That was a. But anyway, I think that's the only time I can ever remember where we did triumph over the engineering organization at the center.
Well, that's an interesting story. Well, we've surely enjoyed. Do you have any more notes, or?
Well, just a couple of, I don't know what your timing is, but I'm getting down to the end. The other thing I was going to mention was mentoring. I thought that, I was mentored by Hans Maus quite a bit in the early days, and I tried to follow that up later, and with a number of people in my organization as I was getting close to the retirement age. And several people in my organization, I think, lived on. John Lynn, Steve Beal became Director of Procurement. Byron Butler, who I believe just now became Director of Procurement. I brought him along in the early days. Charlie Scales, who's now the Deputy for Administration, he was actually hired by Ed Hildreth in the early days, and came up through the communications ranks, and then about 4 years ago, he went to become Director of Administration at Lewis, or Glenn Research Center for a number of years, and then he came back here. And Debbie Bowerman down in the communication organization, and Edwin Jones, who became, I guess is still officially the Director of the Facilities Office, was one of my proteges in the early days. I guess I'll terminate it at that.
Okay, well, it's been a very interesting interview, and we appreciate your coming in, and thank you very much for doing so.
Very good.